Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our program entitled Detecting and Preventing Fraud and Embezzlement in Your Nonprofit Organization. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum. I'm the chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice at the Venable Law Firm. Thank you for joining us for another in our monthly series of nonprofit legal seminars. Started back in April. We're now in December. We're actually going to have another one this month. You get a two for this month due to a special issue that's arisen. But this is part of our monthly series on nonprofit legal and related issues that we've been doing, as you can see, with a number of non-Venable folks as well, to try to give a bit of a broader perspective. It's been a very successful and popular series. For those of you who are in the D.C. area, when we happen to do these, you're always free, like you guys here in the room, to join us for lunch, always a complimentary lunch from 12 to 12:30 Eastern Time. And then for those of you out of town or who can't join us, we have close to 200 people on the phone today from across the country. You're always welcome to dial in on the webcast component for part of our monthly series. Also, if you have registered for today's program, that means you are now on our list, so you'll get monthly email updates with future programs. I should mention the two schedule that we have upcoming. On December 19th, we're going to be doing a program on the new District of Columbia Nonprofit Corporation Act. For any of your nonprofits or affiliates that are incorporated in D.C., not located, but incorporated in D.C., you very much need to be familiar with the significant changes to the D.C. Nonprofit Corporation Act that take effect on January 1st of next year, and which likely and almost certainly will require amendments to your bylaws and other governing documents and procedures. Three of my colleagues from our nonprofit organizations group are going to be leading that program on December 19th. And then on January 26th, title to be determined, but it's going to be a really interesting program on nonprofit executive compensation and automatic excess benefit transactions under the intermediate sanctions rules. A very hot topic, a very important area. A combination of Venable lawyers and some very talented folks from the Mercer consulting firm are going to be speaking on December 26th on that program. Today, a program on nonprofit fraud and embezzlement is this is a topic that my colleague in the middle here, Widge Devaney, and I have spoken on quite a number of times over the last few years. It always seems to be a very popular, very hot topic. No shortage of interest from a very diverse array of folks, lawyers, accountants, COOs, controllers, and many others. We have a good diverse sampling of those folks in the room with us here today. It's an area, as Widge and others are going to talk about, that you never stop reading stories in the news about instances of nonprofit fraud and embezzlement. In fact, Widge and I and another colleague of ours collect an ongoing file of these stories, and it seems like we add new stories to the file, at least several a month. It's an area that never seems to go away. But as you're going to see from today's program, there's many, many things you can do to help minimize the risk of fraud and embezzlement, to be able to detect it early, to be able to prevent it outright, and to be able to know how to handle it when it does occur. Hopefully you're going to walk away from today's program with all of that knowledge. A couple housekeeping things before I introduce our speakers. This program is being recorded, as we do all of our monthly nonprofit seminar webinar series, and the recordings are all housed on Venable's website, and this one will be available starting probably tomorrow afternoon, along with a PowerPoint presentation. You can find all of the archives of all of our recordings of seminars at venable.com/nonprofit/recordings, venable.com/nonprofit/recordings. Also, as many of you know, we have a pretty vast repository of about 600 plus articles and PowerPoint presentations on every conceivable nonprofit legal topic, including quite a number on the fraud and embezzlement topics we're going to be talking about here today. You can find those, which we're constantly adding to the index, at venable.com/nonprofit/publications, and you can search that by topic area as well. We are, as we always do, we'll be taking questions throughout the program today. For those of you in the room, just raise your hand when you have a question, and I will be calling on you at the appropriate time to ask those questions, and our speakers will be repeating those questions for the benefit of those of you on the phone so you can hear. Don't hold your questions to the end. Feel free to ask them throughout. And for those of you on the phone, utilize the chat feature on the webcast. I will be manning that from the laptop here in the front of the room, and I will pose those questions. Sometimes I'll answer those questions directly, but other times I'll pose those to the speakers at appropriate times during the program. Be patient. Sometimes I may hold questions until a later part of the program where I know that topic area is going to be discussed. Finally, I want to introduce our very talented speakers here today. in the order in which they'll be talking. They are going to be doing a lot of back and forth, but first off, today is going to be Widge Devaney, my partner from our New York office, came down to join us today. Widge is co-chair of Venerable's Foreign Corrupt Practices Act practice and anti-corruption group. Widge's practice includes white-collar criminal defense in federal and state proceedings, SEC enforcement investigations, complex civil litigation, as well as conducting internal investigations on behalf of corporate management, audit committees, and special committees of boards of directors. Widge was an assistant U.S. attorney in the District of New Jersey, where he was most recently a member of the Securities Fraud Unit. As a federal prosecutor, Widge investigated and prosecuted numerous cases involving securities fraud, bank fraud, and other types of fraud. To my immediate right is Monica Dawaldi. Monica is a director at the Baker Tilly CPA and accounting firm, and consulting firm, and everything else you guys do, in their risk advisory services practice with 10 years of experience. Monica's primary focus is fraud investigations, internal auditing, and consulting on a wide range of business issues and regulatory compliance matters, corporate governance, and internal control structures at private, public, and nonprofit organizations. I've had the benefit of speaking with and working with Monica over the last couple of years in a variety of settings, and she's a pleasure to work with. And finally, to my far right is Maria Georges, a longtime personal friend, but also a very accomplished banker in the nonprofit world. Many of you probably know Maria by face and by name. She is now a senior vice president in Wells Fargo's Education and Nonprofit Banking Group. She specializes in providing customized financial solutions to national and international nonprofits headquartered in the D.C. area. Maria has been in the commercial banking field for 22 years. She spent the last 20 years focusing her talents on the nonprofit community. For 10 of those years, she worked at Bank of America, where she was responsible for building one of the largest portfolios of nonprofit clients. So you have no shortage of expertise to be shared with you here today from some very talented speakers. Let's just take a look here at the table of contents from your handout materials, or from the PowerPoint slides, I should say. And in your presentation materials, which those of you in person here in D.C. have in front of you in a notebook. For those of you on the telephone, they were emailed out to you, I believe, late last night. You have all of the slides, which is a combined PowerPoint presentation from all of our speakers, and I believe some supplemental materials as well. This is an overview of the topics we're going to be discussing here today. I'm not going to go through this. But wanted to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about here today. And then finally, one question for the group, for those of you here in the room. What do you think the likelihood is that your organization will be a target of fraud in the next 12 months? How many of you think, by a show of hands, not a chance that you're going to be a target of fraud? How about a very low chance? About a third, maybe. How about a moderate chance? Maybe another third. And how about an extremely high chance? I venture to guess no one's going to be raising their hands here today. And the real answer is that it really depends. And it depends on so many different factors, but it especially depends on your ability to implement the things that you're going to hear today. To the extent you have implemented a lot of the internal controls and other protective measures that our speakers are going to be talking about here today, to the extent that you react accordingly when you have signs of troubling behavior, all of those things will have a great impact on the likelihood that your organization will be a target or a victim of fraud. Sometimes you can't avoid being a target, but whether you can avoid being a victim is a different story, and that's what our program is going to be focused on here today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Widge Devaney to get us started. Widge?
Thanks, Jeff. Let me grab the clickers here, and we'll run through. As you can see, we want to talk about a few recent examples of fraud and embezzlement in nonprofits. And this isn't so much a comprehensive list of examples you'll see as we go through, nor necessarily the most recent. As Jeff mentioned, we keep a file of these, and just in the last week or 10 days, I took a look. There was a press report of a couple $100,000 that was embezzled by the principal of a Catholic school in Michigan. There was a couple $100,000 embezzled at a nonprofit in Charleston, West Virginia. That's all in the last week or 10 days. These examples that we have up here are factually sort of the most common frauds. And each one of them highlights a control weakness that we'll talk about later. So it gives us a good factual basis on which to start this discussion. And even as we go through these, you'll start to see some themes emerge. And so the first one I wanted to talk about was the Discovery Counseling Center of San Ramon. It's a nonprofit organization that provides mental health services. Here, the president and the executive director embezzled $150,000 from the organization. He did that by simply using the organization's credit cards for his own personal benefit. That came up and was caught during a routine audit of the organization, which the board of directors then followed through on and determined that there was a real problem there. Next one is the Caribbean Women's Association, and this is another case from 2010. The first one I mentioned was from earlier in this year. The Caribbean Women's Health Association provides maternal and child health care to low-income families. There, again, the executive director gave herself a raise, a significant raise, without the approval or the knowledge of the board. She also embezzled about $20,000 and used the assets of the corporation as collateral in order to get her own home loan mortgage. The next one I wanted to talk about was the Kids House of Seminole, which, again, is an organization that provides money and resources to victims of child abuse and neglect. Here it was the finance director, and you see how these themes are coming out. So far it's been a long-term senior member of the organization who has access to funds, has access to the books and records, which will allow them to cover this up. Here it was the finance director of the organization, as I mentioned, who wrote checks to himself and deposited into his account. When he was confronted by law enforcement on this, his explanation was that he was a compulsive spender. So are many people I know, but they don't steal. And then there's the Pueblo Hispanic Education Foundation, which helps Native Americans pay for college education. Here it was the director who embezzled about $60,000. He forged the board president's name on checks because they did have a dual signature requirement. He funneled checks destined for educational institutions into his own bank account. This fraud is atypical in a way that it gets a little bit more complicated than what you normally see. He also created fake colleges and educational and institutions and had checks written out to them and funneled them back into his own account. He also opened a bank account in the organization's name, got a credit card on that bank account, all without the board's knowledge, and went and used that credit card for his own personal benefit. Trips to Vegas, patio furniture, and jewelry. The interesting thing about this case is this director was on probation for having done the exact same thing at another nonprofit in Denver, Colorado. And so you can see, as we come through these patterns, long-time trusted employees, breakdown in controls, simple controls that might have prevented each and every one of these frauds, and also often a failing on the part of the boards of directors. Now I know Maria has an example also that's near and dear to her heart, so I'll pass it along to her. I'm sorry, it's Monica. Okay.
All right. So this was a case that I had actually worked on a couple of years ago, and I've changed all of the names because it was not public information that would have come out. But in this particular case, there was a trusted employee that was doing work for a COO, and she had direct and indirect access to a number of the financial functions across the organization. So we're talking about credit cards, check disbursements, cashier's checks, wire transfers, access to the general ledger accounts. I mean, you name it, hands in almost every pocket within the organization. And as we started to see, she started off, and you might see this happen in your organization or others, is that it was very small in the beginning. So took her credit card and said, okay, let's see what we can do relative to just a couple of small purchases near my home or residence. Those went through, and she was forging the signature on those different cards before they had an automated system in place. And so then she went to that next level and said, okay, what's going to happen if I start doing some check disbursements? And she had been divorced a couple of times, so all of her kids, 4 of them, had different last names. And so what she would do is take this funding that would come in that could be miscellaneous and start applying it in the form of funds or scholarships to her children. And people wouldn't immediately recognize that it was that individual that it was happening for. When this was allowed to continue, she went and took it to that next level. So there was miscellaneous funds that came into the organization. Imagine somebody passes away, you don't know when that's going to happen. The funds come in. She was able to take it, apply it to an account, and then have a reverse entry go through right that same day. And then she used that money to buy herself a nose job as well as a luxury vehicle. So it was pretty impressive what she had done. And I think when, looking back on it, the question that everybody has is, how did this happen and where was it caught? And if you look at where it was caught, it was really a vigilant AP clerk in the organization that said, okay, something about this looks funny. The paperwork is coming back. There's a little bit of an error in it, and I can't understand why. And it looks like this might be duplicative in nature. It's very similar to a prior transaction we had seen. And just on that piece of information, they called us in, and we did a full-scale investigation of everything that had happened. So just want you to keep that case in mind as we start walking through some of this other information, because I'll come back in reference to it. So some fraud facts here for you. Some of you may be aware of already. Oh. So the question was, were there audits conducted over a period of years, and did this fraud fly under the radar before we came in and did the investigation? If you look at the scale of the organization itself, it was an extremely large not-for-profit. So even though this woman has taken, hundreds of thousands of dollars out of a scholarship program, it was not of a materiality level that the external audit team would have been looking at the exact information the way that she was putting it through. So that's a really good question. And we're actually going to get to a question later about what it is that or a topic around what it is that your external audits are designed to catch and what they won't catch, because I think there can be some confusion there. So as we look at fraud and what's happening within the organization, we've seen over the past couple of years an increase, and I think a lot of you, as I went around and spoke with you about why you're here today, had mentioned either your organizations have seen some level of fraud occur, or that you're concerned that it might, or you've seen it in a prior organization. And with the economy and leaner administrations that are in place and fewer automated systems that are coming into place right now, we've certainly seen that increase. This information is from the Association of Finance Professionals that talks about the fact that checks are a way that they've seen the most fraud occur relative to some of these different disbursement areas. So if that's a place that you wanted to start in your organization, if you haven't already, recommend kind of flagging it as we go along. So one of the key organizations relative to fraud is the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, and I believe our slides are not advancing, but I'm going to continue anyway, and they'll catch up to me at some point. So in that case, what they found is that smaller organizations are more susceptible because they don't have the layers of the infrastructure that you would see at the larger organizations. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to put together, and we have for you, a checklist of sorts that goes through different internal control measures that you would be able to put into place. And so as you go through that list, I encourage you to say, are we doing this, and how well are we doing these things, so that you can start figuring out where you need to move forward. All right, and we're on track again. The other key point I wanted to mention here is that you'll see the higher someone is in the organization, the larger the level of fraud. I think that's fairly intuitive. What we've seen is with assistants or clerks, you might have something around $100,000, but when you get into the controllers and the C-level executives, you start to get into that $1 million plus phase of embezzlements and frauds that occur, which can be a little bit scary, and having those right governance protocols that we'll talk about are so important. So as we start speaking with different individuals about fraud, I think a lot of times this starts with a gut feeling, and I'm a strong believer in intuition and where that might take you relative to the fraud process, but people also want to know, okay, what type of framework might I put around fraud and understand whether or not it's occurring in my organization? This is a framework promulgated by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. It's called the Fraud Triangle. If you haven't seen it before, the three elements are pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Just walk you through quickly what they are. So if you think back to my case with Evelyn, pressure, multiple children, recently divorced, large mortgage payments that were going through, so a lot that was happening within her own environment. In terms of opportunity, think about all of the financial access that she had in the organization, along with the trusted status that she had developed. She was a friend of the COO and did, personal favors for that individual as well. And then rationalization, because this was a difficult time period, the organization had not had raises in several years, and overtime monies had also been cut. And so in her mind, she had justified the fact that she was working harder and deserved to have this, and she sees other people in this very large nonprofit that are doing well for themselves and not struggling as much as she is. Now, if you start to think about, okay, what else rounds this out? Might there be other factors? While this is not officially out there by the Association of Fraud Examiners yet, one of the things that we've started to see are these other elements that have come together around the fraud triangle, which I'm titling the fraud pentagon here, and so that adds arrogance and competence to the mix of what happens. And so in terms of arrogance, I think about bullying behavior, and if you've ever, I see a lot of heads nodding in here right now, if you've ever had in your organization somebody that, they push back constantly, they don't allow people into the space in which they're working. If there's a question about their work, there's, a rude answer. And then when I think of competence, I always puts in the frame of mind that rock star person in the organization that everybody thinks knows how to use every single system, every process, and no one's questioning those components. So when you start to think of all of these together and you have a concern, that might be the point to say, okay, do I need to launch a more formal digging or investigation process? We touched on some of these elements that are on this slide. I just think the one thing that I would mention that's not on here is a lot of times people talk about, when people talk to me about nonprofits, they say, well, they should just operate more like a business. And I don't think that's the standard audit is not designed and should not be relied upon to catch fraud. Your auditors are taking a sample selection of different transactions in the organization designed to see whether or not your financial statements are accurately presented. And so unless it happens to be within their sample or somebody brings it to their attention in what's known as a fraud or SAS 99 discussion, likely they're not going to come across this, especially if it's below the materiality threshold that we talked about earlier. And if it's happening within a higher level in the organization, there's a way to try to conceal or have good explanations for those answers. So what are some things you might do to get the most, I'll say, bang for your buck relative to the external audit practices? If you feel like there's an issue and think back to that fraud pentagon, I would share it immediately with your audit team. See if they can include in their procedures or their testing ways to look for these different types of items. And then also have your audit team test the controls that you think you've put into play so that you have that second set of eyes around those. I think a lot of times people will rely on some transaction or substantive testing, but see if they can actually go in and look at the different controls that you have in the organization that might not directly tie to the financial statement components but are still important key controls for your organization. I want to talk specifically about fraud risk assessment, but I'll pause if anybody has any questions first.
How do you test?
The question was, how do you test? And just to clarify, I'll ask, is it how do you test controls?
Test for fraud.
How do you test for fraud?
Do you run a dummy through or something like that, and then that does it?
So that's a great question. The question is, how do you test for fraud? And actually, if it's okay with you, I'm going to explain what I have on this slide here, which directly relates to how you can test for fraud. So what you have in this situation is performing a fraud risk assessment. And I think this can be newer terminology to individuals to think about what would I do relative to focusing specifically on fraud within my organization. So this takes you to the component of saying, where can fraud occur? And so if you take a look at your financial statements and let's say payroll might be your biggest expense that occurs, what are the risks of fraud within that? Could it be ghost employees? Could it be unauthorized bonus payments, unauthorized overtime payments? The list will continue, but look where you're spending most of your money. Is it through your endowment? Is it with investments? And say, okay, what are the judgment factors, or where do people reasonably have a chance to make some changes within the organization? And then do we have the controls in place to make sure that that's not happening? So in your case, how do you test? You could try to put a bogus employee through the system and see were they allowed to actually be entered into the system itself. I think your audit team would go back and say, do we have the documentation to show that this person is an actual employee? But we've also seen the case where we've taken, let's say you're looking at an estimate or a judgment around what's going to happen with that valuation as a hot topic around investments, and said, okay, if we were to fluctuate the way people are valuing some of these investments, what kind of change does that make in their bonus? And then what does that mean for them at the end of the day around what could happen relative to payments to them? And so you start thinking about all those different factors that could just specifically lead to fraud, and what are the controls you have in place relative to each of those. I would say that most people, when they do this, would reassess. So you go through a one-time assessment, and then every year to 18 months go back and say, okay, what are the new factors in our organization? Have I brought in federal funding? Have I brought in other foundation funding? And where does that raise my fraud risk profile? And where does that raise the risk that I might lose funds or have some type of reputational issue that were to occur? And I'm going to pass it to Widge for strong compliance program, hoping that I answered your question, sir.
A compliance program, regardless of the size of your organization, is probably the most important thing, not only for protecting the organization from fraud or embezzlement, but also to protect the organization from actions of your employees that may rebound back against the organization. And by that I mean specifically any unlawful acts that an employee would take in furtherance of their job. And the one that, just given what I do, the one that the most obvious example to me is bribery. If an employee pays a bribe or receives a kickback in order to get a contract, that type of thing, that is for the benefit of the organization. So the organization can be held criminally or civilly liable for the acts of the employee. So a good compliance program serves two roles. One, it protects the organization against fraud and embezzlement and other types of actions. But given that what the doctrine of respondeat superior is the legal mouthful for that, the way an organization protects itself, if it finds itself in an investigation by the government or by regulators, or even in some civil contexts, is to say, well, look, we had strong controls. We had a compliance program. We had education and training, and there are going to be some bad people out there. But don't come after the organization because we've done everything humanly possible to prevent it, or reasonably possible to prevent it. And that works to lower the organization's liability. So let's talk for a moment about compliance programs, because I think a lot of people have this idea that, well, I'm a small organization, I couldn't possibly have a compliance program. Those are things that General Motors has, or these giant, maybe it's something the American Red Cross does. But the first thing with every compliance program is it has to be tailored to the organization itself. And that is to the size of the organization as well as to the mission of the organization. So if you are a giant organization like the American Red Cross, you might have a very detailed, complicated compliance program with lots of charts and bells and whistles. But if you're a small organization with 4 or 5 people, a policy of 8 to 10 pages is probably just fine. And it needs to be in writing. There needs to be a statement of business ethics, and there needs to be a written policy that can be pointed to and that can be the basis for training and educating your employees. And every employee, and even volunteers where appropriate, certainly board members as well, should be trained in the compliance program and sign a certification that they've read it, they've received the training, and they're signing off on that. The compliance program needs to be owned by somebody in senior management. That's very key. Because if it's somebody lower down or in middle management, people are just quite frankly going to blow it off. It can be this person's not that important, it's their program, it's their thing, whatever. When it's owned by somebody at the very top of the organization, then people take it seriously. And there has to be another level above that, straight to the board, that there's somebody on the board who's tasked with ensuring that the organization has a vigorous and active and monitored compliance program. I'd mentioned before education and training. That's key. Not only in general business ethics, but it depends upon the mission of your organization. For example, if your organization was bringing food into Africa, into some of the most corrupt nations in the world, you're going to need specific training on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-corruption. So it just depends upon the mission of the organization beyond general business ethics. But the most really training, education really helps to protect the organization. The compliance program needs to be monitored. Somebody has to look at it, whether it's your auditors or somebody in-house has to look at it and say, is this really working? Let's check the controls. Is there a fraud hotline? Are people using the fraud hotline or any type of hotline to just report concerns? And it has to not only be monitored, it actually has to be audited. Somebody needs to go in there and check to see that it's working, check to see that it is preventing what it is trying to prevent. The federal sentencing guidelines, which everybody hates to hear that term now, oh my Lord, but they in there, because of corporations who are become criminal defendants, have come up with the official blueprint for a corporate compliance program, which would be the same for a nonprofit organization. And they've got about 10 or 11 steps, and those were just amended last November, so a year, about 13 months ago, to require active auditing of a compliance program in order to be deemed an effective compliance program for purposes of shielding a corporation from liability. So the auditing and monitoring component of this is very, very important. The other thing you need, which is sort of self-explanatory, is a compliance program is great. You can have the education, you can have the training. If somebody violates it, you actually have to do something about it. Whether it's a letter, depending on the nature of the infraction. If it's a letter into their file, a suspension from employment, or all the way up to termination and reporting to law enforcement where that is appropriate. I understand, and Monica made a great point, that there are some sensitivities with respect to nonprofit organizations and reporting to law enforcement, and I certainly understand those. And those need to be weighed in terms of consequences on the compliance program, as well as, we probably need one more. This does not seem to be working very well, but we'll keep going and try to figure it out. But that needs to be weighed not only against what it does in terms of discipline within the compliance program and being able to show to the outside world that you're taking it seriously, but also insurance comes into play there. Because a lot of times in order to make an insurance claim, you need to make a report to law enforcement. So all of those things need to be weighed together. And if you find that there has been a problem, either through the audit, and that problem doesn't necessarily mean anybody did anything wrong or embezzled, but just a weakness in the control, or somebody has embezzled and you've discovered a control weakness, you got to fix it. That's really pretty simple and pretty straightforward.
Which, if I might add
Sure.
in, there's a low-tech and kind of innovative item I had heard at a conference recently that organizations were doing relative to including social media in their compliance program. And so when you mentioned training and education, there was an organization that talked about having a compliance blog, and so that when an infraction did occur, they would change the names of the individuals and some of the facts, but share not only some of the information, but what it is about ethics, morality, values in the organization that they valued that needed to continue forward, whether or not they had made that internal decision to formally prosecute. And so you could start to see that this was becoming ingrained in the culture of the organization. It was a way for younger individuals to participate in something that wasn't necessarily a formal training program, and people could participate at will.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of great technological solutions out there for the training and the education. There's all sorts of great online programs and things like that. So really technology has helped with compliance programs and helped push them out to the entire organization as well as your volunteers in a very good way. And that was also a perfect segue to the next slide, which is tone at the top. Which is part and parcel to a good compliance program, even though it's not one of those things you can go down and check off on the box. But the tone at the top is critical. And if you're ever involved in any type of government investigation, one of the things the regulators or the prosecutors are going to ask is, what's the tone at the top of the organization or at the corporation? And that simply means that the executives, the people at the very top, take business ethics seriously, that they are not going to tolerate breaches in business ethics, and that they push that out to the entire organization. Very, very important. And it helps you prevent embezzlement or fraud within your organization, because you see in some of these examples from time to time where maybe somebody at the C level was living kind of large on the organization. They took a car home every night. They went out to elaborate dinners. Yeah, sure, entertaining might have been part of their fundraising, but they really started to live large on the organization's dime. Well, that says to everybody underneath them, you know what? If they're doing this, well, you know, I need a little bit of money. I'm a little tight this week. I need to make a tuition payment. Why don't I take a little bit more? That seems to be the culture here. And tone at the top is really the people at the top of the organization setting the cultural tone within the organization that a breach of ethics and a breach of the organization's mission and code just simply will not be tolerated. And that also then flows into nicely into the role of the board. Not only do they have a real role at the tone at the top, but the board needs to be paying attention. Very often, especially in smaller nonprofits, you see that board members, it's a social thing. It's an honor. They're some of the largest donors, and now they've been put on the board. Well, with a seat on the board comes real responsibility. The board has to ensure that the organization's funds are being used in an appropriate way, in a sound way, both financially and legally. And they need to be the supervisors, not day-to-day supervisors, but they need to really look at what an organization's managers are doing to make sure that the organization's mission is being fulfilled. And so often board directors think, well, I'm protected by the business judgment rule. And they are to a certain extent, and the business judgment rule is a very good thing. But you'll remember that the business judgment rule only protects board members who have exercised the degree of diligence. So in other words, you have to do some work. You just can't sit back. You have to exercise a degree of diligence that an ordinary prudent person would under the circumstances. And there are many examples. One pops to mind, and there can be personal liability for the people on the board as well. I mean, one example that pops to mind was a nonprofit in New York whose name I forget, who the president of the nonprofit, it was a dance nonprofit, and they had a wonderful brownstone building. He mortgaged that a couple of times, put the money in his pocket, got himself a real estate license, and sold the building, taking the commission. Basically, the organization was done. The board slept through the entire thing. And when the New York Attorney General brought suit, they brought it against the guy who did the embezzling as well as the board members, holding them personally liable for not doing a thing to notice this going on around them or to take any actions to stop it. Maria, I think you're next.
Thank you.
Let me give you the magic clicker here.
Should turn on your mic.
Well, you've heard some wonderful ideas from both Monica and Widge, and what we're going to do in the next section is to really talk about how to implement some of these. So we've got 19 total control measures that we have come up with, and certainly if we haven't thought of one, we'd love to hear from you. But we've literally made a huge list of items to take into account and things you can do in order to protect further your organization. So next time we ask the question, everybody will raise their hand to not a chance will your organization be a victim or of fraud. So, and just a quick aside, but as a banker, obviously I work on many, many cases regarding fraud, and I can count on one hand maybe the number of weeks that I don't hear from a client with an issue surrounding fraud, or at least the perception of fraud, or further digging into a possible fraud issue. And I always know it's a fraud issue because my office desk phone rings, then my cell phone rings, and then I get an email. And that's when I know something's really happening at this organization and they need attention. So, and I had so many case examples, I decided to leave them out, so I might throw them in as I go along. But the number one way that, not the number one way, excuse me, the very first way we've decided to start numbering these is to provide an internal policy of having 2 signatures required or a dual authorization
where multiple layers of approval will help deter some folks. Now, one of the things that folks will say, well, if we have a $2,000 and above, I would really pay attention and do some fact-finding around those under that threshold. Because if everybody knows everything over $2,000 gets a second look, well, most fraud's going to occur right around the $1,900 range. So I would definitely encourage you to look at the lower transactions if you have dual signatures and dual authorizations in place. So some of you might ask, well, I know my bank will not accept two signatures on a check, and I just wanted to point out that you're absolutely correct in the sense that banks will not verify that there are two signatures on a check. We live in an electronic environment where checks are cleared very quickly and without the touch of humans. So it is an internal written policy that should be adhered to. You should require two signatures even though the banks will not verify. So when you get your checks back, I get this question quite often, well, it required two signatures, there's only one, but it cleared. Well, yes, that is going to happen, and unless there is something wrong with that transaction, if it was really not intended to be, then you can bring it up to your bank. But banks in general will not verify. They will spot check checks for things like two signatures or the right signature, but don't count that as a measure to keep, a signature that's not correct on a check. If you're a very small organization and you do not have the staff size in order to provide a secondary signature, consider a board member or one of your volunteers to be a second signature. You definitely don't want, single signatures going out if you want to protect that side. Credit cards, make sure you have written authorization for cost exceeding a certain amount. And the person who's using that credit card should not be the person approving credit card usage. What happens, as we heard earlier, that the higher the level of management that commits a fraud, usually that's the higher dollar volume that occurs. So what do you do when your CEO is having a transaction? Consider having a board member approve the CEO's transactions or the CFO's as well. And then lastly, again, for some of the smaller organizations, we get this request quite often. How do you maybe install a mechanism to catch some of these things? And always have the option of having a second duplicate statement of your checking account go to somebody's home address, maybe one of your board members, and therefore they have the ability to take a look at what's going on. One of our cases that we talked about earlier, the financial director of Kids House of Seminole would not have been able to steal the $48,000 if the two signatures were required. Yes?
Yeah, Maria, I think it might be important to point out, as an auditor, I see checks that are honored all the time with no signature on them whatsoever.
Yeah.
Or one signature where two are required. So while I think requiring the two signatures is a great internal policy method, it's not really a prevention control. You can use it as an effective detection control when it comes to, say, the reconciliation process. Whoever is reconciling the bank statement is actually looking at the cancel check or the images thereof, and they're making sure there are two signatures on checks where the two signatures are required, and whether or not they're investigating them. So I don't think that's really an effective prevention control, but it can be a very effective detection control after the fact.
And that's a very good point for those of you who are not in the room. The point was made that requiring two signatures is not necessarily an effective control measure, and that's because many times, as I mentioned earlier, the banks do not verify signatures. So yes, a check could actually clear without a signature altogether. However, these measures that we've came up with are not intended to solely be the effective control, but remember, it is a collective effort, and you've got to do all of these in order to better prepare your organization. Was there another?
If I might just add in also, I think there's a key point of having the appearance of controls as well, and what that perception might do for you. And if I think about organizations that have installed, dummy video cameras in spaces that don't actually do anything, but people would imagine that there's videotaping going on, they've seen a decrease in the amount of fraud that would occur. Similarly, I live in the district, and one year my car was broken into 3 times, and they stole everything out of it every time, and I got a club for my car. And that doesn't prevent anybody from taking anything that's in my car, but for some reason, my car stopped being broken into during that time period. And so I just think it's interesting having that appearance factor, and I think this is what lends to having that program in place and those policies that the organization would have.
Is there another comment? The question was, are we advocating positive pay? And the answer is absolutely yes. And we're going to cover a lot of those points, again, as we get a little further into the presentation. The backup documentation, you definitely must have an invoice. And, of course, have your invoices approved before they're being paid, and only pay from original invoices. And this ties into another case that I worked on, where the controller would create invoices and have payments being made because her authorization level was up to X dollars. So there were invoices, there were wires being done, except the recipient was a organization that stood for the initials of her daughter, and her daughter's checking account was getting the funds over 11 years and over $500,000 of transactions that were fraudulent. So the very easy question was there an invoice? Of course there was an invoice, but did they exist? And the answer is they didn't exist, but nobody picked up the phone to verify, is this an actual vendor or is this a non-existent vendor?
We have a related question from someone on the telephone who asks, only paying with original invoices is difficult in this age of receiving invoices by email, which are printed in black and white generally. Any suggestions to mitigate this?
Yeah, the suggestion is somebody knows about that invoice. Somebody should know what that work was for, who's being paid, and hopefully it's not the person that's just writing the check. So you need to have those vetted. You need to have somebody look at those. In one of my clients' organizations, the controller, after a fraud situation, literally gets all the canceled checks. Now we image them, but they literally sign off on every single one. And he says, I should know who these people are, and I should know what they're getting paid for. And if I don't, we investigate. And so someone in the organization should know why these folks are getting paid and what did they do. And maybe they already got paid, and there's some analytics we can talk about. I'm sure Monica has great examples of how you can take some data analytics. So if you have a vendor file, there are suggestions on how to sort it. So sometimes it's just a minor misspelling in the name of the recipient, which is really your money is going somewhere else. And maybe, AT&T is getting paid, $10,000 a month, but then you see 3 months where there were 2 payments made to AT&T, but AT&T doesn't stand for what you think it stands. So there's a lot of analytics that happen around invoicing and who gets paid and how that's tracked.
Well, I won't get into the intricacies of some of the analytics like Binford's Law that looks at the variances of the numbers and frequency of the digits. I will mention that one of the other controls the person on the webinar could consider is what's happening around inputting information into your system relative to new vendors. So have you validated that they have an appropriate TIN number, that you have a physical address or a 911 address, that this is actually going to, you don't just have a post office box in place for that organization? Have you had them, sign some certifications around ethics programs that you might have in place? And so getting all that information back and doing those checks on the preventative end can further hamper the ability for someone to do this. That said, if there's collusion that's occurring, you're going to have a very difficult time finding it.
I would just say for smaller organizations, Google and a phone call can will probably knock out 99% of that.
Yep. Absolutely. Make sure there's a phone number on those invoices. That's another thing. Another thing we see a lot of is folks that are getting ready to go on vacation. They'll pre-sign checks. This is so simple. Never pre-sign checks and leave them at the organization. That's just a big no-no, which hopefully not many of you do. And then always, always keep your checks locked. And that means not only checks that haven't been used yet, but even your checks that have come back. If for some reason you are getting checks back, make sure they're kept in a locked place, because all the information you need to create a fake check or an ACH item is on your checks. So again, another case example we can tie it to with the director of a nursing home with a signature stamp, which we don't necessarily like, but we understand that they exist. But keep those locked and under dual control, because you don't want a signature stamp available around for anyone to use. I'll throw it over to Monica.
So we have a lot of information here relative to segregation of duties. I'm going to try to simplify it. So there are 3 components that come into play here. You want to have somebody that initiates, somebody that processes, and somebody that approves your transactions. All of the words on the slides essentially boil down to those 3 components. And we get a lot of questions around, I have 2 people in my finance or accounting function, or they occasionally have to fulfill other roles, or they're out of the organization. What can I do to have these 3 different components that come into play? You can still have those. It's just a matter of being a little more creative in terms of what happens. So it might be that your departments are the ones that are initiating the transactions, your accounting or finance team isn't actually helping to prepare any of the entries that would occur, or on the approval basis, you're having reports that would come out, let's say on a weekly or biweekly basis, that would show the transactions that have been put into your system or process, so that somebody could look at them and understand what's happening from a reasonableness perspective. So not just to let the fact that at any given period of time you might not have 3 or more individuals that are working on these stop you from trying to have those segregation of duties controls that are in place. I think the critical other piece that we have here is make sure that people are taking their vacations. I can't tell you how many times we have found fraud, and I used to work in a financial institution before I started at Baker Tilly, and you had to take a mandatory 5 consecutive business days of vacation, and those organizations of financial institutions that we investigated that didn't, we were able to find things, and so they were, required to go on a training or something like that so that we could see what was happening at their station in their work area. And so it was pretty interesting to go in and do those types of reviews and investigations. As you look at this slide, I'm not going to read the case out to you, but you might think about what extra procedures would you have somebody perform where you have lower segregation of duties than you would like to see. And so are there things that you could do? Are there things other people in the organization could do? So start thinking about where you might not have somebody in 3 different people relative to initiating, processing, and approving your transactions. And then are there any longstanding employees that really haven't taken any vacations, because this might warrant an extra eye or some type of job rotation component that might happen as an extra training mechanism, just to give yourself that extra seal of we have things under control in place here. And then are there any estimates or judgments that are occurring that where a second set of eyes would be appropriate? What we've seen now is that as budgets are starting to open up and you have 1 new person even within a department or organization, they're starting to question some items that have happened for a long period of time, and suddenly you start to see that everything is not being processed in the way that you would like it to be in the organization. And so just considering those as you look at this case. Another one, background checks. We've all talked about this. They're not a catch-all. It's obvious. I was talking to somebody in the back of the room, and their organization deals with a lot of individuals from other countries that don't always have Social Security numbers, and so it can be a challenge relative to how do we perform these checks, especially for volunteers or individuals that want to be engaged in the organization. We have not seen any direct link, and I did a lot of research on this about 2 years ago in helping an organization implement a background checks policy between poor credit and fraud. So don't assume that those are linked together in any way. But if you start to see that somebody does have some credit-related issues and they are in a financial role, think about what other controls you'd like to have in place. That said, almost every time we've gone in and done an investigation, I would say in 50% of those cases, you go back, if they hadn't conducted a background check, we found that there's something on that check that would have prevented them from originally hiring the person. So it doesn't always work in the linear fashion going forwards, but once you have a problem and you look back, you start to see all of the signs there. Of course, hindsight can be 20/20, but I think having that control in place in the beginning around the checks and knowing what you're going to do can be very important here. Couple of items here around fair bidding. I think the key point that I would say and that we don't have on the slide is above a certain dollar threshold. So you're not going to be able to reasonably bid everything. That's not practical for any organization. But if you start thinking about maybe what are your capitalization thresholds, and might that be a place where you have bidding processes in place, or what could you do at the beginning of a year if you know you're going to be acquiring certain services to have some type of primary or blanket service agreement in place so that you're having those protocols and those checks done at the very beginning. Similar point around fixed asset inventory, so above a certain dollar threshold, going back and seeing, do you actually have those items? Are they there, in existence? I think it's a great story that Widge told around the building and, verification of, is this actually our building? It just seems so obvious, but having somebody go in and do that check could yield you a lot of information. We've had to do some checks when I was recently on a construction site, and so you're going out and it's raining, and luckily I wasn't wearing heels, but you're going to see whether or not different pieces of, tractors and other components exist, and this was all government-owned property, so you have to do this on a pretty regular basis, and it gets to be pretty interesting, the things that you find are there and what's missing and, why somebody would have any need for tractor component parts. So encouraging whistleblowers, I'm going to ask Widge to speak about that.
Sure. Excellent control, but also as part of your compliance program, is to encourage whistleblowers, just to make, as part of the training and part of the education, if you see something, say something. It should be set up, in my opinion, you'll get different views from different people, but it should be set up in such a way that report to your supervisor. If you're uncomfortable reporting to the supervisor, report to the compliance officer or whatever senior person has been designated with that function. And very importantly, if you're uncomfortable with that, there has to be an anonymous reporting mechanism. You will not have a strong compliance program or strong controls unless you have an anonymous reporting mechanism out there. And again, it doesn't have to be very expensive. I mean, if you're a very, very small organization, maybe just a lockbox can be enough. But there are technological solutions that are very, very inexpensive for a monthly fee to give an email address and a telephone number that can be used, and that's simply a service that takes the reports, then calls them back in to the organization anonymously. Very, very important, and if you don't have one, I would suggest you go out and do that as basically a step one.
If you do have one, one of the things that our clients noticed recently is that they had two compliance individuals. One of them left the organization, and in doing so, you had, those feet on the ground that were going out and talking to people about compliance, what's going on in their area, a little bit of water cooler talk throughout the entire organization. So while things were quote-unquote reported through the whistleblower hotline, it was because that person was out there talking to them about compliance, about ethics, about what was happening, and so that's how the reports came in. So don't just assume that having that automated line or service is going to be what automatically gets those reports to you instead of to the Washington Post or some other place. Having somebody, actually talk through these different issues, whether it's through a training or whether it's through soccer programs that compliance participates in your organization, that's the informal channels through which we saw a lot of the reports were made.
That's a great point, and just to publicize it, and I've seen organizations that hand out little stickers you can put on your phone, and around the coffee machine and in the kitchens, they've got posters and things. So it really is important to publicize that.
We're going to cover the automated controls, and there are a lot of opportunities for automating many things given today's technological advances and what banks can offer you in terms of information that you can look at. We've covered a few of these already, but I definitely want to talk about a couple we haven't mentioned, and that's the in the area where money is handled, whether it's cash, check, or your finance department. Implement an access control, security codes, badge entry system. If you have that, that's terrific. The other thing is your computer controls. Make sure there are, again, we talked about layering and protection, not only usernames and passwords, but also there are security tokens now that are a physical possession with a number changing that you need to input, so that's an added layer of protection. We've talked quite a bit about segregation of duties and making sure that not one person is entering, approving, and reconciling. That seems simple, but worth mentioning again. And then an easy way for an automated control is for those with credit card usage to implement the MCC code of the cards and where they can be and can't be used. That's easy to implement up front so you don't have those issues to worry about. Okay, and then
can I interrupt you, Maria, for a quick question from the webinar, which is kind of relevant to what you were talking about. This is from someone who was briefly a controller at a nonprofit organization, a new job, where some of the employees resisted review of their records. She was let go because she didn't, quote, fit in. The individual who was complaining the loudest turned out was committing payroll fraud. They were the payroll accountant by issuing paychecks to a fictitious employee. This was in the newspaper shortly after her stint at the organization, and the auditors never conducted the step of delivering the paychecks to the recipients. Any comments, suggestions?
And I want to make sure I understand it, is that the employee that was let go was the one committing the fraud?
No. The employee who was let go was trying to institute some of the things that we're talking about, and the person who was committing the fraud kind of pushed back strongly and caused that person to be let go.
That's a very interesting point, and as another case study of something very similar is I had a large client who I was trying to get in front of, and they resisted meeting with their banker, and I couldn't understand why they didn't want to meet with us. And I had sent an agenda of all the items we were going to cover in the meeting, and of course we were going to go over controls and procedures and talk about updated features to positive pay, et cetera. Well, of course, the reason for their resistance, we found out afterwards, was she was embezzling money and didn't want to come under fire during, finding out that there was ways to implement controls, and so I don't know what the lesson of that story is. But anyway, I want to go ahead and cover a few more points since we're running out of time. But there are great mechanisms for those of you to be now notified when money's leaving your organization, whether it's by ACH, wire, or any balances. You probably have an idea of what the balance threshold should be in your account. Sign up for these services. A lot of banks have mobile banking capabilities on the commercial side, and therefore you can get a lot of notifications about what's happening with your bank account. So I highly encourage you looking into that. The next thing we're going to discuss is the employee discussions. I think we've talked about this, so I may just skip it, but essentially is, who do they contact if something happens, and the multiple layers again, thank you. Okay, the dual control, which I think is such a vastly important, thank you, such a vastly important concept, and a lot of banks, including my own, is going to make it a requirement. And this is really important. Anytime money is going to move out of your organization, you need to have two people looking at that transaction. That requirement also means that when you're setting up your online banking system, I can't just add a user without somebody approving it. And so you got to be a little concerned about collusion, so maybe people in different offices or people who aren't sitting next to each other. But dual control is one of the best ways to have things. So I initiate, he approves. If he initiates, I have to approve, but not one of us can send a transaction out without a second pair of eyes. let's see, we're on 41. Some of these are great to use, and I understand you may not have the capability to implement all of them, but a dedicated computer for online transactions is a terrific idea, especially with all the possible malware and phishing attacks that could occur. So if you can institute a separate computer for online banking transactions, that's highly suggested. And then again, we go back to the physical security token that we've talked about a little bit earlier. Make sure you update your antivirus program and institute all vendor-recommended firewalls. That's such a simple solution. We're branching out a little bit from embezzlement from an internal source, and now we're looking at also how can external fraud can occur. So a lot of these are going to factor in both situations. Protect your network. Don't allow access to social media sites, to auction sites, personal email accounts. Your employees may not be happy with some of these implementations, but you are making your organization a lot stronger by doing so. Instituting transaction daily limits, and that doesn't necessarily mean that you can only do X today, but also reviewing them. What's your average? And when you have your bankers meeting with your bank or when you talk to your auditor, make sure that you review those limits. Your organizations change, your transactions change, so set those. If you change your maximums, change your minimums, so folks don't get used to being able to have this much authority. So make sure that you are evaluating that on an ongoing basis. The diligent user management, going back and auditing, but not only the larger dollars, because a lot of things that happen are on the smaller end. Next, I'm going through these quickly since I want to have room for questions. Monitor and reconcile your accounts daily. I changed daily to weekly or monthly because some organizations would find it simply impossible to go in on a daily basis and monitor their accounts. So I highly suggest that at least on a monthly basis. And there's a lot of reasons for that besides just catching fraud, but it's a very effective way to know what's going on in your bank account. And you can automate reconcilement services, so a lot of that can be happening for you in the background, and all you need to do is to review those. And of course, if you see something out of the norm, if you're not sure about something, call your financial institution and get some background on it. Monica, I'm going to throw it to you for the next couple.
Relative to appointing an internal audit resource, I think there are a number of ways to approach this, and it's not just what you might think of, whether you might already have an internal audit function or a couple of people, one person dedicated to this. If for some reason that's not feasible within your organization, we've also seen where somebody that might be within finance or accounting or have that type of background would play that hat for a certain period of time, and you could start small and they could start looking at what are their highest risk transactions within the organization, do some testing relative to those, and then move that process forward on a different basis. So there's a way to think about, are there existing employees that have, frankly, you need a little bit of interest and enthusiasm to want to do some audit work, but can we put them into that position? And then if there's nobody that fits that mold, you might think about having a firm come in and in part do some audit work for you, internal audit work, so that you have available to you whatever resources are out there, but you don't need to have somebody on that full-time basis. In this area in particular, it can be challenging to keep people from an internal audit perspective just because of the fact that they're moving, transitioning, and you have firms like ours that are trying to snatch them up as well.
Question?
Is there a dollar threshold above which you see organizations having a sort of full-out internal audit function? At what size of entity would you see people having more than one or more people sort of dedicated to this full time? At what size organizationally do you see people having outside firms sort of coming in periodically to
Got it. So the question was, at what size would you typically have an internal audit function or an internal audit resource, and at what size might you have a firm that participates in it? I'm actually going to change your question a little bit, because the way that I've seen this happen more often is it's not necessarily a dollar threshold that's in place, but it's around what is the risk level within the organization. So let's say you're getting a lot of federal funding, and you don't have people with the background around what to do with the OMB circulars, or if you're a government contractor or you have to apply FAR and CAS standards to what you might do, or you have international operations and FCPA compliance might come into play. It really depends. If what you're doing is very vanilla, I'll say, in terms of your operations, likely you're not going to need to have a lot of specialized expertise around an internal audit function, because your finance or accounting individuals might be catching those transactions anyway. But if you start to see that you're in a little bit more of a complex arena, you have construction projects that are occurring, you see people in your arena have had, information technology breaches that have occurred, you're expanding into new programming, that's when I would say that you would dedicate some resources to internal audit. And the reasons that we've seen people go with a firm is either they've had challenges in keeping the resources and it's not their mission to keep, train, and update internal auditors, because that's a challenging thing to have to do, or they can't keep the level of skills that they need, because you need a lot of diversity around information technology, construction, sponsored research if you have federal funding that's coming into play, as well as understanding of how to work with the boards and other governance entities that you might have. And so if you have a firm that helps you, you can pull in those levels of expertise as you need them, and you don't need to keep training your own people to have that expertise. Does that help?
We're going to race through the last few slides, but I think they're very important, so I'm going to hit some highlights. There are two types of, I'm sure you hear you may not know what the terms are, but you probably know what they're doing, and it's malware attacks and phishing attacks. Phishing is when you get an email saying this is your bank, it looks and feels like your bank's email, but we can't process a transaction because we're missing information. Could you please, etc. Send us your account number, send us your, or call this number and give us your password and we'll help you. Well, that is a phishing attack most likely, because I don't know of any banks that will ever ask for your information via an email. Pick up the phone, call the number that you know is your bank's, and ask if there's a transaction issue, but do not reply to those emails. As a matter of fact, delete them. And then malware is when there is, because we talked a little bit earlier about having social network sites or access to personal email accounts, there could be a virus that's being sent to you and unknowingly takes over your computer, and therefore will take all that information that you're entering and then will use it against your account. And one of the reasons we said earlier about using a dedicated computer for online transactions is really for that reason, is to keep that computer clean, no other information goes on it, and therefore you wouldn't have somebody taking over your computer and credentials. And having a separate dual control method, again, they may have one set of information but not the other. That's why the dual control also comes into play. Online fraud does hit 3 out of 4 companies, so it is something you should be worried about. It is a very prominent way to get defrauded, and that's because it's easy, it's faceless, and nobody knows who's on the other side of that computer. We talked a little bit about that. How do you identify a bogus site? Just so you know, when you are at a site, in the event that you click on something, if you don't see the S after the HTTPS, S stands for secure site, if you don't see the S, and at the very bottom of the screen, if you don't see the padlock, that means it's not a secure site. Question?
When I go to my bank's website and I start typing it, auto-complete, and I've heard someone say, don't auto-complete that, just retype it in every time. Is that just a rumor?
I have not heard of that, so I don't know if anybody has, the question was, once you start typing on your browser the bank site that you want to go into, it auto-completes it, and the question is it true that you should not select it once it's auto-completed, but you should continue to type it through? And honestly, I haven't heard of that one, so I don't know if anybody else has an answer to that. No, but we could look into that. I'll find out. I have good people to talk to. And then lastly, I want to touch on laws and regulations that actually focus on fraud, and whether the Regulation E is the federal law that protects consumers from unauthorized electronic funds transfers. That's EFTs that you hear the acronym of. But those protections do not apply, the same protections do not apply to business accounts. So keep in mind that there are separate regulations and separate laws around a business account and a personal account. And then the Uniform Commercial Code, Article 4A, is the one that really you need to be familiar with about what is ordinary care, we talked about that, and commercially reasonable standards. It really defines that. And of course, your personal bank relationship could define how a fraud investigation really goes and how, who really is liable for those funds that are unauthorized. And make sure you know from your commercial account agreements, what are the number of days that's stipulated by your bank in order to report a fraudulent transaction, because every bank has a certain number of days allocated that would like to hear from you, and that's why we said reconcile your accounts daily, weekly, monthly, because most banks will only give you 30, 45 days after your statement is sent in order to get back to them about anything that's not kosher. I think I'm going to skip the next couple because we're running out of time. And obviously, the minimizing check writing and doing more things electronically with dual control will help reduce check fraud. And check fraud is the number one way still that fraud is committed, because paper is easy to change in today's technological world of being able to print checks and just steal the credentials. And it's also very visible amongst many hands that touch, the transaction when it's a check written. So with that, I'm going to sum it up and turn it back over to Jeff with any remaining questions.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Monica and Widge as well. With the 5 minutes or so remaining, anyone have any questions for our panelists here in the room? And certainly feel free to pose your questions on the chat feature on the website as well.
When you're investigating potential embezzlement, you're still trying to figure out, it's easy to kind of look through your own internal documents, but do you have any tips for how to deal with outside of your organization, whether you're trying to determine whether funds ended up in someone's personal bank account, or how to track to continue that investigation beyond your own doors?
Sure. Well, it really depends. Oh, yes. When you're investigating a fraud, it's easy enough to look into your own books and records, but how do you go outside of the organization to seek records or information concerning the fraud or embezzlement? I think it really depends on the specifics, but some of the things that we talked about before, if you're wondering about, okay, this invoice doesn't quite look right, at that point, call the company. Google the company, that type of thing. Really try to check each of the transactions in question to see if you can legitimize them. Call the bank if you only see one signature. Ultimately, too, once you've done your due diligence and you've looked into it, talk to the employee. That's perfectly acceptable, perfectly rational. You don't have to accuse them of stealing. Just say, okay, we have some questions regarding these transactions. See what their answers are. See if their answers check out. If you do think that there's a real problem there, one thing I would advise is to pull one of your backup tapes so that employee, often there's a lot of evidence of any type of wrongdoing that are on the emails. People think in this day and age who's stupid enough to put something on emails, trust me. I don't know how cases were. I started as a prosecutor in the days before emails, and I'm not sure how we did it back then. But pull a backup tape. Very simple. The person doesn't even need to know about it, but it does make sure that, except for something that they might have hidden on their hard drive, that it's there.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add that if you're ever questioning the receipt of the funds, that's where your bank can help you identify where the funds went. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the person that received it, but there's a trail, obviously, and you can get all that information from your bank.
I think Widge makes an excellent point about asking them, and to make it real, we had an individual that we were concerned about was taking monies in the form of kickbacks relative to construction type of project. And this, there were rumors floating around that entire department. And so we went in consultation with some fine attorneys like you'd have here at Venable, said, okay, what if we were to tell the individual essentially, because they know these allegations are floating out there and we want to see copies of their bank statements and their tax returns. And so we went in and we asked them in the vein of, if you're not doing this and you want to be able to show it to us, provide us with these records. And the individual did. Then that's not to say that it didn't occur in any other place and there weren't accounts that he didn't provide to us, but everything that we found was pretty forthcoming in terms of the way that the information was delivered, and so it was helpful. And so just that mechanism to be able to ask to get it, it was surprising to me how much information people will provide when you do ask them for it.
And let me put in a small, albeit shameless plug for lawyers, since Monica opened the door. Thank you for doing that. But consider bringing counsel in early on, and the reason for that is not only counsel as well as folks like Monica are expert in these types of investigations and can really pinpoint it, but more importantly, attorney-client privilege. If there's anything that could blow back against the organization, if a lawyer is conducting the investigation, it's all privileged. Even if they're using accountants, you set up a legal fiction that the accountant's actually hired by the lawyer in order to assist the lawyer. And then we just sit back and let Monica work for the next 3 months. But it really does help protect the organization against information. If you decide at the end of the day you don't want that out there, then it's privileged.
Yeah, it's a really important point. We've done that quite a number of times, Widge and I and others working together with clients of ours. Of course, the attorney-client privilege has its limits. You have to control who has access to that privileged information, who hires the outside experts like the accountants that are being brought in, who that information is shared with, being sure it's only shared with a control group of say, board members and senior staff and no one else, even other outside vendors or contractors who may be involved in order to protect that privilege. But if you do, then at the end of the day, you have that option of keeping all of that information confidential and privileged. We had a question there in the back, and then I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah, I want to go back to what you said earlier, William, about when fraudulent activity has been found by management and the board, that you need to determine whether or not it's appropriate to let the appropriate law enforcement know. Is that based on a level of whether it's a misdemeanor or a criminal? And it seems to me you need to let the authorities know.
No, well, as a general rule, there is no duty in the United States to report a crime.
Even from a fiduciary standpoint?
Well, that gets into something a little bit different. If you do have fiduciary, if you're holding something as a fiduciary, you might have some obligations because it would be a civil breach of your fiduciary duty not to take action at that point in time. So it's really going to be very fact specific. But as we mentioned, there are other reasons as well. A big one, collecting the insurance money, almost always requires a report to law enforcement.
Okay. I want to thank our, we'll take your question afterward, but it's 2 o'clock and we need to wrap up. First off, I want to thank our speakers for a really terrific job today. Secondly, I want to apologize to those of you on the phone. The folks in the room may not have realized it, but we had some pretty severe technical difficulties today stemming from our service provider that it didn't allow the webinar to go online for about 20 minutes starting from the outset. The good news, though, is that we were able to record the program from the outset, and that will be available on our website tomorrow along with a full PowerPoint presentation at venable.com/nonprofit/recordings. Everyone who is registered for the program also will receive an email tomorrow with a link to those materials, and feel free to share those with your colleagues and others who might benefit from those. Finally, don't forget our 2 upcoming seminars on December 19th on the new D.C. Nonprofit Corporation Act and on January 26th on some nonprofit executive compensation issues. With that, thank you again for coming, and if we don't see you later this month, have a great holiday, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.